Mark Stevens wiped sweat from his brow as he finished the final touches on his restored 1970s John Deere tractor. The emerald green paint gleamed in the afternoon sun, a stark contrast to how he found it 3 years ago, rusted and abandoned in his late grandfather's barn. The tractor wasn't just transportation. It was a family heirloom in the heart of his modest 5-acre homestead that sat precisely where two worlds collided. His property marked the boundary where the manicured lawns of Oak Ridge Estates abruptly met actual working farmland, while the HOA residents behind him paid landscapers to achieve the perfect natural look. Mark's callous hands told the true story of someone who worked the land himself. His small flock of chickens clucked contentedly as they pecked around the yard, and Jasper, his rescue goat with one crooked horn, watched curiously from his pen. Mark had built this place from nothing, working double shifts at the manufacturing plant while living in a camper until he could afford to build his ranch-style home. Not bad for a blue-collar guy surrounded by executives, he muttered to himself, admiring his handiwork before heading inside, unaware that his peaceful existence was about to collide catastrophically with Oak Ridge Estate's newest resident. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across Mark's property as he carefully closed the tractor shed door. The sturdy padlock remained open. Who would steal a tractor out here in the countryside? Besides, Ellie Thompson next door kept an eagle eye on both their properties. At 78, the retired schoolteacher missed nothing and feared no one, not even the increasingly aggressive HOA that had tried twice to purchase her family's historic cottage. "Evening, Mark," Ellie called from across the fence, her silver hair catching the sunset's glow. "That tractor sounds better than it has in years." Mark smiled, walking over to where Ellie stood with a basket of fresh tomatoes from her garden. "Finally got the timing just right. Grandpa would be proud." William Stevens was always particular about his equipment, Ellie agreed, handing over the basket. "These are for fixing my porch steps yesterday, and fair warning, I saw that new HOA president driving by earlier, taking pictures of your place. Woman's got more starch in her than my Sunday blouse." Mark accepted the tomatoes with a shrug. "Let her look. My property's grandfathered in, they can't touch me." "Don't underestimate determined rich folks with too much time on their hands," Ellie warned, her expression serious. "That one's got something to prove. I've seen her type before." As if summoned by their conversation, a gleaming white Range Rover with OAKRGG vanity plates crept slowly past Mark's driveway, the driver's silhouette visible behind tinted windows. Mark raised a hand in greeting, but the vehicle accelerated away toward the subdivision entrance. "Friendly bunch," Mark said dryly, earning a knowing chuckle from Ellie. Later that evening, as Mark sat on his porch with Jasper the goat curled contentedly at his feet, he scrolled through his email and found an official-looking message from the Oak Ridge Estates Homeowners Association. Subject line: "Your GENT Property Compliance Inspection Notice." Those chicken coops are absolutely visible from the Henderson's breakfast nook, and the bylaws clearly state that no livestock or farming equipment should be visible from any HOA property, Deborah Whitfield declared, jabbing her manicured finger at satellite photos spread across the Oak Ridge Estates conference table. 6 months into her reign as HOA president, Deborah had already become notorious for her emergency meetings and enforcement crusades. Today's target, the properties bordering their pristine subdivision. The other board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats as Deborah flipped to a photo of Mark's homestead. "This is the worst offender," she continued, her voice dripping with disdain. "Did you know he keeps goats? And that eyesore of a tractor ruins the entire view from the eastern walking path." What Deborah didn't mention was her real motivation: impressing the visiting regional HOA committee next month with a community connection event highlighting the area's agricultural heritage without any actual farming or dirt involved. Her vision included tasteful hay bales, plastic wrap to prevent mess, children's farming activities with sanitized plastic tools, and the piece de resistance: charming hair rides on an authentic tractor. Her own husband had already struck out trying to rent one from local farms. As the meeting adjourned, Deborah's gaze lingered on the photo of Mark's gleaming John Deere. "Send him the standard inspection notice," she told the secretary with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'll handle this property personally." "Deborah, if I may," interjected Ryan Henderson, a newer board member who'd moved to Oak Ridge for the schools rather than the status. "That Stevens property is actually grandfathered in. It was here long before the subdivision, legally speaking." "I'm well aware of the legal technicalities, Ryan," Deborah cut him off, her smile tightening. "But our community standards still apply to view sheds. We can absolutely require mitigation of eyesores visible from our properties. We tried that approach before," the HOA treasurer, Bill Forsyth, reminded her. At 68, he was the board's oldest member and remembered the previous failed attempts to force the Stevens property into compliance. His grandfather had good lawyers. The property line is the property line. Deborah straightened her Hermes scarf with a dismissive flick of her wrist. That was before my time. Sometimes fresh tactics are needed. After the meeting, Deborah lingered, gathering the satellite photos into her leather portfolio while mentally calculating costs for her return to our Roots event. Her husband Tom, a weary-looking man who'd aged 10 years in the 6 months since they'd moved to Oak Ridge, poked his head into the conference room. "Ready to go, Deb? We're already late for Connor's lacrosse practice." "You take him," she replied without looking up. "I need to visit the community center to measure the lawn for the event setup." Tom's shoulders slumped slightly. "The event that's still not approved in the budget?" Deborah's head snapped up, her eyes narrowing. "It will be. The regional committee chairwoman is my sorority sister. This Community Excellence Award is practically guaranteed if we offer something unique." She tapped the photo of Mark's tractor. "And I know exactly what we need." Later that evening, Deborah sat in her home office, scrolling through her social media feed filled with other HOA presidents showcasing their community achievements. Her previous neighborhood's new leadership had just won a Best Community Garden Award, with photos receiving hundreds of likes. The woman who'd beaten Deborah in last year's election was now being featured in a regional lifestyle magazine. Deborah's jaw clenched as she closed the laptop. She moved to Oak Ridge Estates specifically because it offered better networking and visibility. After Tom's lateral career move, a demotion he wouldn't admit to, she needed this win. The regional award would open doors to the country club board she'd been eyeing, where connections to the right people could salvage their social standing. "Ma'am, you're trespassing," called out Ellie, Mark's elderly neighbor who lived in the small cottage adjacent to his property. Deborah startled and quickly regained her composure, squaring her shoulders beneath her crisp white linen blazer. "I'm conducting an official HOA inspection," she replied, flashing a laminated badge as if it granted her legal authority. A notification was sent last week. What she didn't mention was that she'd waited until seeing Mark's truck leave for work before making her move. Ellie narrowed her eyes but retreated back inside, reaching for her phone. Meanwhile, Deborah meticulously photographed every violation she could find, her designer sneakers becoming increasingly muddy as she ventured deeper onto Mark's property. The chicken coop, the workshop, the small greenhouse. Everything was documented with commentary into her phone. Unsightly feed storage, improper waste management, excessive vehicle parts. Her inventory paused when she spotted the tractor shed's open door. The John Deere sat gleaming inside, even more impressive up close. Against her better judgment, Deborah stepped inside, running her hand along the polished metal. Her eyes caught on a pegboard where keys hung neatly labeled. A slow smile spread across her face as she spotted the key-marked GD tractor. She hesitated only briefly before pocketing it, already calculating dimensions for hay wagons in her mind. Outside, Jasper the goat watched through the fence, chewing thoughtfully on a tin can as the HOA president committed her first felony. Inside Ellie's cottage, the elderly woman punched Mark's number into her rotary phone for the third time. "Come on, pick up," she muttered as it rang through to voicemail again. Mark was deep in the manufacturing plant's machine room, his phone tucked away in his locker as company policy required. Ellie hung up with a frustrated sigh and peered through her lace curtains. The HOA woman was now inside Mark's tractor shed, clearly overstepping any reasonable boundary. Ellie Thompson hadn't taught middle school for 40 years without developing a keen sense for troublemakers. She grabbed her walking stick and sun hat, determination etched in the lines of her face. By the time she made it across her yard to the property line, Deborah was emerging from the shed, something small glinting in her hand before disappearing into her pocket. "I called the sheriff," Ellie lied smoothly, her voice carrying across the yard. "He should be here in about 10 minutes. Mark gave him permission to remove trespassers when he's not home." Deborah's steps faltered, but she recovered quickly. "That won't be necessary. As I explained, this is an official inspection." She held up her phone displaying a document. "We have jurisdiction over VUSH violations." "VUSH, my fanny," Ellie snorted. "That badge you're flashing's a pool pass. I helped design them for the community center last year." A flash of alarm crossed Deborah's face before her features hardened. "Mrs. Thompson, isn't it? The board has concerns about your property as well. Those garden gnomes violate Section 8.3 of the..." "Stated for someone who cares," Ellie interrupted. "I was here before your fancy subdivision existed. Now, what did you take from Mark's shed?" "I didn't take anything," Deborah responded too quickly, her hand instinctively touching her pocket. "I'm simply documenting violations for our records." Just then, Jasper the goat let out a loud bleat and headbutted the fence, startling both women. The distraction gave Deborah the opportunity she needed to retreat toward the property line, her pristine white blazer now smudged with barn dust and her designer shoes caked with mud. "This property will receive a formal violation notice," Deborah called back as she hastened her steps. "The board will be discussing potential fines at next week's meeting." Ellie watched her go, noting the license plate on the white Range Rover parked at the end of the gravel drive. Once Deborah had driven away, Ellie, "Ladies and gentlemen, I present the highlight of our return to our Roots Community Day." Deborah announced into a portable microphone, gesturing grandly toward the rumbling John Deere tractor pulling a hay-filled wagon toward the Oak Ridge Community Center. Residents applauded, impressed by the elaborate setup and blissfully unaware of its origins. Deborah's husband, Tom, looked considerably less comfortable behind the wheel, having spent a stressful morning helping his wife execute her plan. "Are you absolutely sure you got permission for this?" he had asked repeatedly as they hitched the borrowed wagon to Mark's tractor at dawn. Of course, Deborah had lied smoothly. He's being compensated through the community fund. Now, dressed in a $300 designer flannel shirt and artfully distressed jeans that had never seen a day of actual labor, Deborah played the role of farm tour guide with theatrical enthusiasm. "Who wants to experience authentic farm life?" she called to the crowd and excited children. 8-year-old Tyler Jenkins raised his hand. "Does the farmer know you took his tractor?" he asked innocently. Deborah's smile froze momentarily before she laughed too loudly. "Of course, sweetheart. Farmer Mark was very generous to loan us his equipment." Across town, Mark's phone buzzed with a fifth missed call from Ellie as he helped his brother move furniture, completely unaware that his prized possession was now giving hayrides to families who paid $15 each for the authentic experience, money that was going directly into the HOA's beautification fund. The morning had begun in near disaster. Tom Whitfield, bleary-eyed from lack of sleep, had followed Deborah's SUV to Mark's property at 5:30 a.m., questioning his life choices with each passing minute. "Deb, this is breaking and entering," he whispered as she unlocked the tractor shed with the stolen key. "We could go to jail." "Don't be dramatic," she replied, flipping on her phone's flashlight. "It's simply unauthorized borrowing for a community purpose. We'll have it back before he returns tomorrow. Besides, I left a note." The note was a generic HOA letter pushed halfway under Mark's front door, stating only that community equipment was being utilized for the event. It mentioned nothing about his personal tractor. Getting the tractor started had been another challenge. Tom, whose driving experience was limited to luxury sedans and golf carts, stared at the controls in confusion until Deborah found a wrinkled operator's manual in the shed. 30 minutes of grinding gears and false starts later, the John Deere reluctantly roared to life, belching a cloud of black smoke that made Deborah jump back to protect her designer outfit. "Just drive it slowly down his access road," she'd instructed, hurrying back to her SUV. "I'll meet you at the main road with the hay wagon." Now, as Tom circled the community green for the third time with a wagon full of giggling children, he was sweating through his polo shirt. The tractor handled nothing like the promotional materials had suggested, its steering heavy and temperamental. Every bump elicited cheers from the passengers but sent waves of anxiety through Tom's already frayed nerves. "Isn't this delightful?" Deborah gushed to the regional HOA committee chairwoman, who had arrived with a photographer in tow. "We're really connecting our community to its agricultural roots." "Very quaint," replied Chairwoman Patricia Harrington, wrinkling her nose slightly at the authentic farm smells emanating from the hay. "Though I must say I'm surprised you managed to secure a genuine tractor. The insurance requirements alone must have been prohibitive." "I think we should stick to the paved paths," Tom muttered nervously as the tractor lumbered along with its fourth group of passengers. Deborah shot him a withering look from where she stood on the hay wagon, microphone in hand. "The Millers paid extra for the extended tour," she hissed. "Besides, that field connects directly to the nature preserve. You'll be fine." The nature preserve she referred to is actually Mark's lower field, currently saturated from 3 days of spring rain. As Tom reluctantly turned the tractor onto the unmarked field, 12-year-old Aiden Miller shouted excitedly, "This is where that guy keeps his goats." His mother, Jessica Miller, Deborah's chief social rival, smiled smugly. "Actually, I've heard the owner makes artisanal cheese that's sold at the farmer's market." "Perhaps we should have included local vendors in this event, Deborah." Before Deborah could respond with a cutting remark, the tractor lurched violently. Tom revved the engine in panic as the back wheels spun, digging themselves deeper into the mud with each rotation. Children screamed in delight, thinking it was part of the entertainment, while their parents clutched the sides of the suddenly tilting wagon. "Gun it, Tom." Deborah commanded, her perfect event crumbling before her eyes. The tractor responded with a sickening mechanical groan, followed by a loud pop and the distinct smell of burning oil. Black smoke began billowing from beneath the hood as dirty water reached the engine. Jessica Miller pulled out her phone and began recording as panic descended. "Everyone off," Tom shouted, killing the engine as the tractor settled deeper into the muck, now stuck at an awkward angle with one wheel nearly submerged. Deborah stood frozen, watching in horror as designer shoes disappeared in the mud and parents lifted screaming children from the wagon. Is this part of the authentic farm experience? Jessica asked sweetly, her phone still recording as Deborah's carefully applied makeup began to streak with panicked tears. The transformation from orderly community event to chaotic mud pit happened with breathtaking speed. One moment, the tractor was bouncing along the edge of what Deborah had confidently described as our community nature trail, and the next, it was sinking into the soggy earth like a stone in quicksand. The rear wheels, already hot from hours of continuous operation, spun frantically as Tom tried to power through the increasingly wet terrain. "Stop spinning the wheels," shouted Ryan Henderson from the back of the wagon, the only person present with any actual knowledge of tractors. "You're just digging us in deeper." But Tom, driven by panic and Deborah's increasingly shrill commands, kept alternating between gunning the engine and slamming the gears in reverse. The tractor responded with a series of mechanical protests before a loud crack echoed across the field, followed by an ominous hissing sound. The distinct odor of burning clutch plates and scorched oil filled the air. "My Gucci loafers," wailed Jeremy Parker, the HOA treasurer, as he stepped ankle-deep into the mud after sliding off the wagon. All around them, parents were lifting children whose once-clean event t-shirts, specially printed with Oak Ridge Farms for the occasion, were now splattered with mud. Chairwoman Patricia Harrington stood on what remained of solid ground, her face a mask of barely contained disgust as she watched the scene unfold. "Deborah," she called over the chaos, "I believe we've seen enough of your community spirit. We'll be in touch about the awards." "Wait," Deborah shrieked, attempting to wade through the mud toward her. "This isn't. We're just experiencing a minor." Her words were cut short as she lost her footing and landed face-first in the mud, her designer outfit instantly transformed from country chic to swamp creature. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, followed by the unmistakable sound of Jessica Miller's camera shutter. "Mom," called Connor, Deborah's mortified teenage son who had been reluctantly helping with the event. Is that the guy who owns the tractor?" Mark stared in disbelief at the scene before him. His grandfather's tractor, the machine he'd spent countless hours restoring, sat half buried in mud, its engine compartment open and clearly damaged, surrounded by yellow caution tape. He returned late Sunday evening to find Ellie waiting on his porch with an expression that mixed anger and sympathy. "You've got some HOA trouble," she said simply. Nothing had prepared him for this. As he circled the disaster site, Mark's phone buzzed with a text from his buddy at the local repair shop. Extraction estimate, $1,200. Engine repair likely $3, $5K, sorry man. A fresh wave of anger washed over him. He'd worked overtime for 3 years to restore that tractor. Grandpa Stevens had taught him to drive on it when he was just 9 years old. The sentimental value was incalculable. Early Monday morning, Mark walked into the Oak Ridge Estate's office wearing his work clothes, covered in the mud from his overnight attempts to assess the damage. Conversation stopped as he entered. Deborah was mid-sentence at a table with several board members, a stack of photographs spread between them. "There he is," she said, rising quickly. "Mr. Stevens, we were just discussing your property's impact on." Mark cut her off by slapping the police report onto the table. "Vehicle theft, trespassing, criminal damage to property." His voice was quiet but carried clearly through the silent room. "Officer Ramirez took extensive photos this morning. He's particularly interested in any security footage showing who took the tractor, though Ellie's statement should be enough." Deborah's face drained of color. Behind her, the HOA secretary whispered, "We have cameras at the community center entrance." Jessica Miller stood suddenly from the corner where she'd been pretending to read magazines. "I have video of the entire incident," she offered helpfully, holding up her phone, including Mrs. Whitfield specifically ordering her husband to take the tractor off-road after he objected. The room erupted in chaos as Mark turned to leave. "My lawyer will be in touch about damages," he said over his shoulder, just loud enough for Deborah to hear, both to the tractor and to the reputation of whoever stole it. Sunday night had been the longest of Mark's life. After the police had taken statements at the scene, including those from several Oak Ridge residents who admitted seeing Deborah and Tom removing the tractor early that morning, Mark had spent hours with a rental spotlight examining his beloved machine. Officer Ramirez, a fellow mechanical enthusiast, had winced at each new discovery. "Water in the crankcase," Mark had muttered, his voice thick with emotion. The transmission shot. They even cracked the original steering wheel. The officer documented everything methodically, his face grim. "We don't usually see grand theft auto cases involving tractors," Ramirez had remarked, "but the value exceeds felony thresholds, especially with the damage." He paused, glancing at the mud-splattered HOA president being questioned by his partner. "Though the DA might offer a plea deal if full restitution is made." Now standing in the HOA office that Monday morning, Mark watched a very different Deborah Whitfield from the mud-covered wreck of Saturday. She'd reassembled her perfect appearance, but her eyes betrayed terror as the police report's implications sank in. This is a misunderstanding, she began, her voice higher than usual. The tractor was borrowed for community purposes. Without permission, Ryan Henderson interjected, standing from his seat at the table. The board never approved this, Mark. We had no idea she'd taken your property. Bill Forsyth, the elderly treasurer, nodded vigorously. First we knew was when it showed up at the event. We assumed there was an arrangement. The secretary, a timid woman named Linda, pushed her glasses up nervously. I have the event budget here. There was no line item for equipment rental. Mrs. Whitfield told me you donated the use as a community goodwill gesture. Mark's jaw tightened. The only gesture I'm making now involves lawyers. Tom Whitfield appeared in the doorway, his face haggard from what had clearly been a sleepless night. Mark, he said wearily, I know no apology is sufficient, but I want you to know I tried to talk her out of it. I should have tried harder. You were driving my tractor into my field after stealing it from my property, Mark shot back. Apologies don't fix that. Deborah suddenly switched tactics, her voice taking on a syrupy, persuasive tone. Mark, may I call you Mark? Surely we can resolve this between neighbors. The HOA has insurance that could cover the repairs. There's no need for police involvement that